All right. Well, hi, Dr. Way. How are you doing?
Hi, good, good. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to do this with us. I'd like to start by getting into your background into this field of human development. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you get into it and what your work has sort of revolved around?
Yeah, so I was back in the 80s when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. I was really interested in teenagers and adolescents because I saw this period of life as more complicated than how it was being represented, which is just sort of teenagers are, or their hormones are going crazy, they're doing irresponsible behavior, they're engaging in high-risk behavior. And I really saw it as a period that was actually much more interesting than it was being portrayed in how you read about teenagers and adolescents, and my field is called adolescence. And so I was interested initially actually in counseling teenagers because I was realizing that they were sort of, I got it that they were sort of misunderstood. I was a teenager at the time, so I got it that they were being misunderstood. And then I ended up applying to a doctoral program in Harvard in counseling psychology initially. And I went to Harvard and I started my doctoral program. And I started, as part of my training, working in a high school. And in the high school, it was definitely becoming very clear that how we were reading about teenagers in our classes was totally different than what they sounded like in the high school that I worked at. And then I realized that it was much deeper than even I thought the problem was, which is that we were really telling a story that just wasn't true about teenagers. And so I switched actually into a program on human development and psychology because I realized I didn't want to actually be a therapist. I didn't want to be someone who's helping individuals. I wanted to change the story and how we told the story of teenagers. And then I realized I actually wanted to change the story of how we tell the story about humans. So not just this period of life in particular, but actually what it means to be human based on what we learned from teenagers. And then finally, the final sort of piece in the story is, in particular, certain types of teenagers, which was boys and young men in the story of human development were really being radically misrepresented. And they were telling us a story about the importance of their friendships. This is back in 1988. The importance of their friendships and the importance of those friendships for their health and well-being. And I was struck at the time why we weren't listening to that story, why that story of friendships, but also that boys and wanting emotionally intimate friendships wasn't being told in the culture. And I have to say, Fatima, it still is not being told. It still is not being told in this mainstream culture we have. So that led me sort of on the trajectory of looking at human development, but particularly focused on friendships, and really, as I know you're interested in as well, but really a focus on human connection.
One of the big reasons that I wanted to have this discussion with you is because I know you have decades of experience researching human connection. And a lot of my curiosity when it comes to this subject lies around whether we have a crisis going on currently. If you could talk a little bit about where you think the problem lies, and if you could also give us a lens from your, of course, research, from the history and the past decades. Was it always this way, or is it particularly our current times where we're facing this crisis?
Yeah, so another good question. So I would say because we know we have a history of horrible behavior toward each other, whether it's in the history of slavery, misogyny, racism, homophobia, religious intolerance, right? We have a whole history of centuries and centuries of terrible behavior with each other. You could argue that the division across social groups have existed for as long as we know, right? So that hasn't changed. So the crisis of connection across groups, unfortunately, is embedded in the history of our world. What has changed is the crisis of connection that you're seeing in communities. So the whole idea, the crisis that you're getting within communities of loneliness, alienation, friendlessness, not feeling like they have anyone to turn to, depression, anxiety, all that is a crisis of connection where we're disconnected from ourselves and each other, and not just disconnected from people who don't look like us, but actually even disconnected within our families and within our peer groups. So the crisis of connection is a more recent phenomenon, I argue, from the data, and you see it in the data in terms of friendships, starting in about the 1980s. which was the period of, in this country, was Reaganomics, where we started to have vast income inequality in the United States. And you started to see the decline, basically. That's really the beginning where you start to see the decline in having someone you could turn to, close friendships. And then you saw a dramatic decline in the early 2000s, and I can talk about why. And then now you're starting to see a further decline, but it's also starting to be stable, but it's very low compared to, like, say the 60s and 70s. So you really are starting to see an increase in a crisis of connection, but again, I would argue within communities, not across communities, which sort of has always existed, unfortunately.
Yeah. And can I ask you to go into the reasoning for this crisis?
Yeah. So this is the story that boys and young men tell. So I think it's very important that we understand that everything that comes out of my mouth is really what I've learned from young people. And for this interview in particular, it's really what I've learned from boys and young men, particularly boys and young men of color, so Black, Brown, Asian American, some white boys as well, mostly from working classes communities, and at this point it's from all communities. But the original findings are really from, which I want you to ask me the question of why, from what I call the communities that are the fringes of power. So not the boys that are, so young men who are sort of at the most privileged, but actually the boys and young men who sort of what I call at the fringes of power, they have less power than people in the center. And to me, that's a reason why they tell us a human story that you don't get necessarily in the center. So why is there a crisis of connection? It really has to do with a culture that we're swimming in, the culture, I always say the cultural waters in which we swim, that has embedded in it a hierarchy of humanness, which is you have certain people who we consider more human than other humans. So within a capitalist system, we value rich people more than poor people, we value men more than women, we value white people more than people of color, and we value people who identify either as agnostic in this country or as Christian, we value more than people who identify otherwise. And so that hierarchy of humanness is already damaging to our capacity to connect to ourselves and each other, because any culture that has a hierarchy of humanness where certain humans are seen as more human than others is going to have problems. But we don't just have a hierarchy of humanness, and this is what's never been talked about, but it's clear with the boys. This is my contribution really, coming from the boys exactly, is we also have a hierarchy of human qualities. So we value what we've deemed masculine over what we've deemed feminine. So we value thinking over feeling, the self over other, autonomy over connectedness, stoicism over vulnerability. I could go on and on and on, right? Math and science over humanities and poetry. Emotional regulation over emotional sensitivity. So all those things, when we value money over people, when we value the hard, what I call the hard over the soft, creates a disconnection from the self, because we're naturally hard and soft. So Chinese philosophy, the yin-yang model, values, right, both sides of our humanity, the stereotypically hard and the stereotypically soft. When you only value half of our humanity, it creates a disconnection to the self, because boys and men, for example, know that they have a soft side because they live with themselves every day, and they have feelings too, and they express their feelings, as they see in this book. But we live in an entire modern culture that's pervasive around the world, that says only your hard side is valuable, and not only is your soft side not valuable, it's lame. It's lame to be sensitive, it's lame to care. But if you don't have the soft side, you can't be autonomous, and we know that from the research. You can't actually, in a healthy way, express your hard sides if you don't have a soft side shaping that hard side. So I'll give an example. We know in the research with babies, in the developmental research with babies, that those babies and those children that are able to be most autonomous, explore their environments freely, feel secure to leave the home when they grow up, are those that are most connected to their family. So if you're not connected to your family, you don't have the internal sense of self-worth to be autonomous. So autonomy and connectedness are deeply linked, like the yin and the yang. They're deeply linked with each other. So you can't have one without the other, right? And we think you can just push our children out to be autonomous, but you can't do it unless they're deeply connected and they maintain that connection, right? That's something Americans have always gotten wrong, that we think we're just going to focus on. Think about our notions of maturity. It's only about being self-sufficient and being able to do things on your own. It's not about being able to have mutually supportive relationships, not only with your peers, but with your family, which is a part of what it means to be mature, is to be able to, have mutually supportive relationships with your family members, your mom, your dad, your grandparents. And so to me, that missing, not only do we not value the traditional, what we've feminized, but we think it's lame. So that obviously that hurts everybody, not just boys and young men. It hurts everybody because it's not just about manhood. And this is the thing nobody's hearing. It's also about how we construct maturity, right? So it's also embedded in the very notion of what it means to be a grown-up, is to focus only on your hard sides. So it's the cultural waters in which we swim. And why did it get worse in the 80s? Because ultimately what happened in the 80s, and you see this with Reaganomics, where we started to deregulate the economy and income inequality started, people could get richer fast. We started to literally, right, even more so value money over people, because all of a sudden people that didn't expect to get very wealthy could get very wealthy, right? Or people who were wealthy already could get super wealthy, right? And so you started to see the explosion of the super wealthy, right? You see that in the movies, right, about Wall Street and all that kind of things. And so we started to actually, literally beginning in the 80s, according to the data, started to actually value money over people more so than we ever have in our history. We've always valued, as a capitalist economy, money over people, but we haven't done it to such a raw degree as we started to do in the 80s, and now as we're, the epitome with Elon Musk essentially serving as our unelected president. And why do we think that he has anything to say? Because he's super wealthy. Right. So we confound intelligence with wealth, et cetera. All of us are perpetuating this hard over soft dichotomy, the hierarchy that leads to our crisis of connection.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful to know. And one sort of thought that I've had, because I'm an immigrant in the United States, and so I've come from an Eastern culture, and I read a lot about the differences between the East and the West, of course, and you've mentioned the importance of individualism, the differences in how maturity is defined between the two cultures, the need for autonomy. All of those are very different in the two cultures, and you've also studied, like you just mentioned, the Chinese culture. What would you say is something that they're doing absolutely right compared to the Western culture, where individuality is sort of what's focused on the most?
Well, so this is the sad thing about and I've lived around the world too. I've lived in China, I've lived in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East, and I basically know a lot. I was born in Paris. I would say the sad thing about the state of culture at this point, modern culture, is it's globalized. So American culture is now everywhere. So knowing China, so I lived in in the 80s when I was a teenager. I'll give you an example. In the 80s, men could hold hands as friends, and it wasn't deemed, gay. When I moved back to China in 2007 with my children to Shanghai, men could definitely not hold hands because it was, in the Middle East, there used to be, even as of 10 years ago, in Abu Dhabi, men would greet each other by touching each other's noses, and now you never see that because that's been deemed gay. So American homophobia and, that kind of hyper sexualization of human needs and capacities, and also the obsessive focus on autonomy is everywhere now. So you see it in our Chinese data, you see it everywhere. So the whole sense of the value of communalism, of family, you obviously still see it in pockets, and you still see it in the United States too, because remember, even if it's our ideology, you have all sorts of families that value families within the United States, but these ideologies dominate. So the me that you definitely, I feel in some ways is rooted in the United States in particular, is just now everywhere. So you see it in China now. They're no longer this sense of filial piety that was traditional to Chinese culture. That's disappearing. It's the sense that it's about the children, that they don't want to have children anymore because it's a burden to have children. They just want to focus on themselves. Young feminists now, right? The feminism is now being defined, I think, I identify as a feminist, obviously, but it's being defined in a very me way. So it's all about what I think rather than how do you work with other women to support other women, right? In collectively coming together, as well as with men. And so to me, the me unfortunately, because of the power of American culture, it's won. And I would say won, meaning W-O-N, because of capitalism. Because it's the carrot has been, if you do it this way, right, you'll make a lot of money. And so people are like passively following the carrot of a lot of money, and the consequence is the crisis of connection and hate and violence and all the things you're seeing. Depression, anxiety, loneliness, suicide, violence. It's all rooted in we are privileging money over people and not going back to the basics, which is in traditional Eastern philosophy and traditional cultures around the world, which is the primacy of our relationships and our communities. Because what you hear from boys and young men in these narratives is the desperate desire for relationships and the desperate desire for deep, meaningful connection. So when you listen to young people, that's all you hear. That's all you hear is the desire for human connection. So the reason why I sort of am so I can be so critical of the culture is you have an entire century of young people in the data, but also in our newspapers, essentially asking the grown-ups, what's wrong with you people? Why aren't you valuing what we all want most, which is each other? And why aren't you valuing it? And why aren't you telling us that we should go out in the world and have healthy relationships and help us have healthy relationships? Why are you privileging academic achievement and which college you get into rather than
how much money you make?
Right, and how much money you make rather than, you know, are you finding the relationships that you want and need? And how can I help you do that? Right?
So Dr. Way, I'm curious, a lot of the conversation so far has been focused on your research and your work. Can I ask you on a personal level, if we zoom out of here, like you mentioned, the whole world has now got the same problem. It's been globalized. When you walk into a room of new people and you want to be able to build genuine, meaningful, long-lasting connections with them, how do you go about it versus just a surface level discussion with them and then you never see them again? How are you doing that?
So basically, I have an idea which I refer to in Rebels that's social connection 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So I'll walk it through so people can understand. So social connection 1.0, which we've been doing for a long time now, and we certainly do in our technology. And I'll talk about the technology as well, which is we don't take seriously, we see it as a soft skill, social connection, human connection, so we don't take it seriously. So we think that if you just bring people together and you say, hey, connect, you know, that they'll connect. So that's the premise of all social media, but it's also the premise of a lot of efforts to build connection, is they just bring people together and then they say, hey, connect. And everybody knows what happens. It's like when we tried to desegregate schools. You bring people together and guess what happens? They either isolate themselves or they just talk to the person they already know, and if they do talk to the person they know or they hang with the people they know, oftentimes the conversation is superficial because part of our culture thinks that, and I'll get to the superpower of the secret sauce of human connection, which is curiosity. Oftentimes we have deemed curiosity kills the cat in our culture. So we think curiosity is a negative thing. So we ask questions that we don't really know, we don't really care about the answer. We ask questions that keep us on the surface of things. We think talking about ourselves create connections. Talking about ourselves does not create connection. And so we have all these biases because we don't take human connection seriously as a real thing, that you actually need to use your 5-year-old skills to actually do well. But we don't even value those 5-year-old skills. So that's social connection 1.0. Social connection 2.0 is you see a little bit with all these card games coming out where you have questions to ask. You have a deck of cards and you each get a question. And that one is sort of moving in the right direction because it's building on this curiosity. I call it interpersonal curiosity. But again, it repeats the same problem. We think I ask you the question, and then I ask somebody else the question, then I ask the third person question, and they all answer, and then you're thinking, well, that didn't help connection. Like, okay, so I told you that if I was on a deserted island, who would I want to have for dinner? You know, okay, so what? Social Connection 3.0, which is what we're doing, we're building technology around it, we're trying to even build a center around it, is really about recognizing that basic thing that all 5-year-olds know, that the initial question is just the entry into something, that follow-up questions trying to really get at your meaning making actually take not only work to get you to tell me what you really experience in the world, but actually take a series of practices that I talk about in Rebels, We have 9 practices of listening with curiosity, like asking open-ended questions, asking contrast questions, asking all sorts of types of questions that give someone a platform from which to really investigate how they experience whatever your question you're asking. And the question doesn't have to be what I call a trauma question, right? Like most people actually, like for me personally actually, I don't actually find a connection gets generated when we share each other's traumas, because the trauma part to me doesn't form the connection. What forms the connection is actually my curiosity in you and your experiences, and what I can learn from you about your experiences, not just from you, but about me through you. And that learning about you and then learning about me through you, that's the secret sauce of connection. And that comes from our natural capacity to look at each other with wonder and say, these are my questions about the world. What do you think about, who do you want, who do you trust the most and why? What do you want in life and why? Where do you belong and why? Right? I mean, all those 5-year-old kinds of questions that 5-year-olds will oftentimes ask, the why questions, is really a way to genuinely connect. But we have to recognize that the way we learn about ourselves is the big kicker, is through listening to others. Talk about them, right? That's how we learn about ourselves in response to our questions. And that actually is, this is the hard thing for people to hear. Listening with curiosity in a genuine way is actually a metacognitive skill. It's a very, very sophisticated skill that I now, every way I teach, every way I raise my kids, everything I'm doing now is infused with curiosity. So I get, for example, in the classroom, I get students to turn to it doesn't matter what I'm teaching. Any content I'm teaching. In the first 10 minutes of class, they turn to each other, they have to do an interview, sometimes I'll provide the question, they have to each do it equal time because some people talk more than others, and everybody has to be a question asker and someone who answers the question. And it has to be mutual. That's also a secret sauce to connection. Absolutely. It has to be mutual. Yep. It can't just be connection, curiosity one way. Yeah. And a lot of women talk about frustration with men, that they're the askers, right? And the men aren't the askers. They don't reciprocate, and then they wonder why, the man will sometimes wonder why the woman is not as interested, because if you don't have curiosity in your conversation, there's no connection, right? It has to be mutual. And I think we downplay, because we feminize interpersonal curiosity, we downplay the importance of interpersonal curiosity in human connection.
I'd like to go back to the idea of curiosity, because I think as a 20-something-year-old that's of course interacting with other 20-something years old.
Exactly.
The one thing I'm noticing is, it sounds like from your answer that a lot of connection building stems from curiosity.
Yeah.
But what exactly is your response to the problem of curiosity not existing, of people not being curious about each other, and so there is never that initiation of let's connect with each other?
Because we happen to know that we're born curious. So the question is not, what do we do when someone's not curious? The question should be, of all of us, why are we born so radically curious? I mean, you can hear it in 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6-year-olds. And what happens that we lose our curiosity? And what happens essentially is a culture that's incurious and that feminizes interpersonal curiosity, right, and then puts it on the bottom of the hierarchy, rather that we privilege intellectual curiosity over interpersonal. In fact, we privilege it so much that in the field of human development, I have a paper that just came out. I'll give you the title of the paper so it tells you the thesis. Interpersonal curiosity, the missing construct in the field of human development. We don't even study it. We study all other aspects of child development. We don't even listen to interpersonal curiosity. So we don't value it. So what happens is it disappears. But this is the amazing thing. Because it's natural to us as a species, we're naturally curious. We see it. That's how we connect very early on. That you can bring it back really easily. So you just have to basically give people, as I call it, the permission to ask, by actually saying, okay, today, every day in class, we're going to do this curiosity exercise. I'm going to give you the questions. Sometimes you get to pick, this is how you're going to do it. It has to be both ways. You impose the structure, and guess what happens? That 5-year-old self comes roaring back. You're walking into a context where nobody's being curious. Just start by asking. Say, I want to ask a question of everybody. I want everybody to ask the question of each other. And pick a good one, like the one that students love, is tell me about your first name. What's the story of your first name? And everybody will go, oh. You know, and I'll say even whether you like it or not, and why don't you like it, and why you like it, and what name would you like to be called? And everybody loves answering that question. And so the idea is that that kind of simple question, it's not a deep, profound question. It just starts the sense of coming to know each other, coming to know, and it's not just an icebreaker. I really want to challenge the icebreaker idea. Asking you real questions is not an icebreaker. It's the fundamentals of human connection. And don't demean it. You're demeaning it by calling it an icebreaker, right? You're saying that it's a sort of superficial thing. It's an icebreaker. No, it's the whole substance, right? It's not the surface. It's the deep stuff. But make it a real question. Don't just say, you know, where do you come from, and then assume, you know, if you say Toronto, and then assume that's the end of where you come from. Yeah. You know, how'd you get to Toronto? Why Toronto? You know, what do you think about living in Toronto? We both had that conversation about how there's a lot of Pakistanis in Toronto, and that becomes more interesting now of why you're in Toronto, right? And your experience of living in Toronto. So the idea is even a question that could sound sort of surfacey, like where do you come from, can be a deep and profound question if you ask follow-up questions.
Yeah. I have a few different directions I want to take, because I have a few different questions that came out of that answer. I'll go to the direction of this idea of performative curiosity, and I don't know if it's a real term.
It's a good phrase, and you should define it for how you define it. But go ahead.
And I'll give, you know, our example. You're of course you're a professor, you're of course a researcher, you have a whole lot of experience. And if I wanted to come in here and build a connection with you because I just want to know people that are intellectuals and they're just good connections to have, I'd come in here with a whole lot of performative curiosity and acting like I'm really interested in knowing everything about your life and asking questions. Where do you think, what work do we need to do to make sure that we lessen performative curiosity and there's actual genuine curiosity where when you give me a response, I truly care about wanting to learn more about you?
So two ways. It's a great question, Fatima. It's a really great question. I would almost argue in a culture that's so incurious, when my standards are so low in this culture that if I see performative curiosity, it's a first step. It's a baby step. So I actually don't have a problem with performative curiosity. It's not going to teach you much, because if it's performative, it means you won't ask follow-up questions. What you'll do is you'll wait for the answer. So if you were interviewing me, you'd say, you know, tell me about your work, and I would say what my research found, and then you'd say, okay, and then you'd ask me the next question. So performative won't lead you to much understanding, but at least it's a start. So I don't want to diss on performative curiosity, because I do think sometimes it's a way for someone to feel comfortable in their own curiosity. However, because it is oftentimes has an agenda that's not about curiosity, but about you liking them. For example, I think sometimes women who are trying to engage with a guy, their curiosity is genuine, but I think they also want the other person to like them, so they'll ask questions. The limitation of that, it's not necessarily a negative thing, but the limitation is just not going to lead to much. It's not going to lead to the connection they're looking for. Because ultimately, not only does it have to be mutual, but curiosity really has to be willingness to follow your own logic, and not just insist on my logic. So where performative curiosity gets in the way is if I give you an answer that's not what you expected, what you're going to do when it's performative is you're going to correct me. I'll give you an example, because it happens. I train interviewers, so I know this happens. You'll say, tell me about, you know, is your work, you know, I'll give you a question you asked. Is your work really focused on gender? And I'll say, no, but it's about what boys and young men teach us. And you'll say, okay, so your work isn't really about gender. And I'll say, well, it is, but it's not, you know, but it's not actually. And you'll say, okay, so it's not about gender. So what is it about? Right? And then you wouldn't have heard me at all, right? Because you're expecting me to say, no, it's not about gender, because I told you before the interview it wasn't about gender. So you'll expect that, and then you'll keep on repeating the same thing, and I'll be like, well, no, actually that's not really what I'm saying, and then you'll continue to correct me. That's performative curiosity, because it's actually not curiosity. You're just looking for the answer that you expect them to give, that you want. And journalists do this all the time, right? They're looking for you to say what they're writing their piece on, and the longer I don't say it, the more frustrated they become, and then they want to finish the interview, right? Because I'm not willing to say what they want me to say. Right. That's performative curiosity. Genuine curiosity never does that, because genuine curiosity, you're actually trying to learn something new that you didn't already know. So if I say, my work really isn't about gender per se, you would say, what is it about? Right? What do you see it's about? Yeah. You wouldn't say, you wouldn't just pursue the gender line. You'd say, well, what is it about? Exactly. So that you really are starting to learn something new. So how do you sort of encourage that type of curiosity? I would say you oftentimes have to start with performative, and then what happens when I teach interviewing is people will get frustrated by the quality of their data, because they won't get interviews where they are really getting at meaning making. And I'll say, listen to your questions. Listen to your questions. You didn't follow up. I call it curated follow-up questions. You didn't follow up with the logic of what they were sharing to you. Yeah. You just were going on your preset questions. You weren't actually listening to what they were saying. So what it means is, if you're not really listening to what they're saying, they're checking out in their responses, because they're feeling, oh, this person's not really listening to what I'm saying. So I'm just going to give you the surface. Yeah. So you have to, the burden of the interview is on the interviewer, right? Is to follow their 100%. Curiosity. And the minute I know you're following your curiosity, which I can tell in this interview, it motivates me to talk about my experiences, because I feel confident that you can hear what I'm saying and that you can follow my logic, even if it's not the same logic you have. Yeah. Right? That you can follow and try to make connections.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah. And I think that's very, just like you mentioned it, even in regular day-to-day interactions, very prominently seen when someone's performative versus
totally.
when it's very genuine.
No, absolutely. And the other thing about performative is that, again, because I get this with journalists all the time, is that they will ask questions. They will say, I really know your work. I've read something about your work, which by their questions I can tell they don't. Okay. And they will start to ask a series of questions, and they really don't, I've said this before, but I'll repeat it again. They're clearly not listening. And so how you can tell something's performative is when you give a response and you know the person hasn't really heard what you said. Yeah. And that's performative curiosity. However, it's better than no curiosity at all.
And from my personal experience, Dr. Way, the whole reason I'm here is because of the sheer unfulfillment you feel, interacting with other people and not feeling energized by those interactions, because it's just draining to be in those situations.
Yeah, exactly. I would say I am increasingly isolating myself just to those relationships in my life where there's mutual interpersonal curiosity. And if there isn't, I am moving away from those relationships, because as an old person, I'm exhausted. And it's depressing to me, and I can't deal with it anymore. Yeah. So, maybe there's some relationships within, people I have to deal with, and certainly I'm not including my students, because it's not mutual in that case, obviously. But basically, it's too exhausting. Absolutely. Social interaction that keeps on the parallel play is not interesting. It's exhausting, and it's depressing.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of our problem stems from currently.
Exactly.
So Dr. Way, that's a really interesting point, and I'd love to hear, and I want to ask you more about your personal experiences and your own sort of strategies when it comes to relationship building, but also parenting and how it all starts in the home. Yeah. Before we get there, I'd like to go back to one of your previous responses where you said you learn about yourselves as you interact with other people and connect with other people. Yeah. There's this quote in my mind, it's been in my mind for a long time, and it says, your ability to connect with others heavily relies on your self-awareness of how much and how well you know yourself, and only then you'll be able to connect with others. Yeah. Where would you say our society is in terms of self-awareness? Are we at least self-aware people?
Yeah, so I'm writing a new book right now, and that I'm going to switch the script there, because I used to meaning 2 weeks ago. Okay. I'm writing a book now called, for Harvard University Press, called Our Social Nature in an Antisocial Culture, a 5-part story. And I was reading some philosophy from the early part of the 20th century, and it probably was Eastern philosophy, because that's where I get all my insights. And it said, I used to have the belief, exactly what you just said, that self-awareness is necessary for seeing the other. And we have very little self-awareness. So if you don't understand yourself, you can't understand the other. And I have been promoting, and I have a think and do tank called the Project for the Advancement of Our Common Humanity, with the premise is, if you can't see your own humanity, you can't see the humanity of others. And I still believe it in many ways, right? If you can't see your own, you can't see somebody else's, certainly. But I've been realizing and thinking about how individually focused we are, but how we're naturally social. We're social animals. We've known that for a long time. And that's validated in the social neuroscience, that we are inherently social animals. You know, we think about how we structure our society. We are social animals. That I actually think it may be the reverse, that we only see ourselves by seeing others. And so it's our lack of seeing others that has led to our lack of self-awareness. Right? And because I think the reason is, and I'll give you an example, because how we see ourselves in others is through contrast. Contrast is, and similarities and contrast, but contrast includes similarities and differences. I'll give you an example I always give my class. So if you were looking at the color of, green is the perfect example, of a green sweater, and you were to describe the color green, it's very hard to describe the color green without comparing it to other colors, right? It's just very, very hard to describe green, right? Because what is green? So you have to almost always, in your head at least, compare it with other colors. It's the same thing as with humans. So my father said to me when I was a teenager, and this is very meaningful to me because this is when I realized I have the paradigms switched around. He said, because I remembered this thing he said to me when I was 18. I was very interested in American teenagers, and he lived in China at the time. And he said, if you want to know American teenagers, go live in China, because you can't see yourself if you can't, right? If you only, right? If you cannot see yourself if you only see yourself, right? So I think that's exactly what's happening, is that the more solipsistic we're becoming, right? Meaning, the less we are looking at others, the less we can see ourselves, because we don't have the contrast. And remember, contrast is not just difference. It's the similarities and the differences. We cannot see ourselves if we're only looking at ourselves. And think about all the meditation, all those things that are just about self-awareness. We can't have self-awareness if we have no other awareness. We just can't do it. Yeah. And in the same way that you cannot describe yourself if you only know yourself. Yes. Right? You have no sense of who you are if you have no sense of who somebody else is. And that, I think, I realized this about 2 weeks ago in the midst of writing this new book, and it hit me like a bomb, because I thought, think about it. As a social animals, we are constantly gaining self-awareness through recognizing the similarities and differences we have to other people around us, not only people in our family, but people outside of our family, people who live in different cultures, who live in different places. They're constantly seeing themselves better through seeing the differences and the similarities to people who look similar to them and who look different from them. And that's how I gain my self-awareness. I have lived, so have you. I have lived in different cultures around the world. I come from a whole family of different cultures, with different races, different cultures, different religions, embedded in my entire family. And so I am I would argue, super self-aware, because I see the similarities and I see the differences in every context I've ever lived in. Born in Paris, raised in different contexts and cultures, lived in China, lived in Abu Dhabi, right? I mean, all sorts of places, and traveled around the world, not as a tourist, but as family members from different places. As I told you before, my sister-in-law is Pakistani Canadian. And so the idea is that gives me self-awareness. And think about a country that not only speaks so-called one language, right? Most countries speak many languages. We have an obsession with only English. We don't teach languages in college anymore. We don't value being more than monolingual. Even though we're traveling more than we used to, we still think most Americans, my guess is the numbers still travel within the United States for the most part. The wealthy travel to other cultures, but they don't experience other cultures. They experience their own wealth in fancy hotels. So that's not really going into other cultures. So the idea is, think about that. And then it creates a less and less self-awareness. So we are less self-aware than we used to be, I think. Ironically, because we're traveling more, but not because it's an inherent thing. It's because we're not seeing others, right? And then that creates the less self-awareness.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's a very, very interesting
Don't you think
point.
it's a good point?
Because my thought always was, you just have to be a very, a person that reflects a lot to know a lot about yourself, and
Yeah.
then to be able to go out into the world and connect
Right.
with others.
But that's the Western myth, right? That it comes from the guy alone in a log cabin, thinking the philosopher sitting alone and that comes to ideas. It's not the way it works. It's actually being in the world. And that's what, in some ways, feminist philosophers show us, women of color philosophers, right? They show us that it's actually being in the world, right? Being in the world, living in the world, that you come to see yourself. And being in a log cabin in the sort of romantic sense of writing your book as a philosopher isolated from other humans, that doesn't create self-awareness, that creates solipsism, where you think your ideas represent everybody's ideas, which is the history of Western philosophy, right? Where my experience, because of everybody's experience, because I've never heard about another experience.
Exactly.
And so to me, I would almost claim that my perspective is that the only way you see yourself is by first seeing others, comes from a kind of critical race, feminist orientation, that it's actually recognizing, right, the other, right, as both similar and different, that allows you to see yourself.
I'd like to learn more about how you practice connection building after having learned so much about it and the different, sort of ways to go about it as well. How are you, when it comes to being a mom, for example, what practices are you instilling in your parents that will set them up for success down the line when it comes to building connections?
So, it's interesting because that's been a journey for me. So I would say in the first part of my career, I had my kids in my mid-30s, mid to late 30s, so I started late. For New York, it's not late, but it's late for the country. And so I was sort of entrenched in my career by the time I had kids. And I definitely did the classic, women academics do this a lot, of really making separation between my work and my children. So what I was learning in my research, in my head when I was in my late 30s, had nothing to do with how I raised my children. So I was doing that split, that funny split, that's my work, and then here's home, and I'm just going to be the mom, just to be a mom, and a loving mom, in the way I could define loving. And it was really listening to teenagers that I began to realize that I was doing that classic split that would cause a problem, that I wasn't taking what I was learning from young people and using it to be a parent. And that only started, I would say, when Deep Secrets came out 10 years, or 12 years, 13 years ago, and it was I was inundated with mass media. I was on the Today Show multiple times. I was profiled in the New Yorker and the New York Times, and an Oscar-nominated movie came out based on Deep Secrets. I got an enormous amount of attention. And that shocked me. I didn't expect to get that much attention, and the basic story was that boys want friendships. That was the basic finding back then. And all of a sudden, I realized, that was my transition. I realized I've touched a cultural nerve. I've touched a cultural nerve about friendships and about human connection. I didn't get it until then. I thought it was just my research about boys' friendships and that they were important. I didn't see it, and I didn't see it related to my parenting. And by that time, my kids were already like 8 and 10, right? But at that moment, I realized how much I wasn't valuing human connection in the way I was raising kids, and that I was buying into a culture that valued, the hard over the soft. I started to see myself because of the reaction I got. This validates my theory, right? Because of the reaction that I got from others to what I was saying. And I thought, oh my God, I'm actually doing what I'm critiquing, right? I'm pushing my kids to get into sports because I know it's going to look good on their college application rather than just what's fun, but actually what will look good on their college application. Even in the early years of my high school for my daughter, my big question, my curiosity was, did you do your homework? Do you have a test, and how well did you do on the test, right? So that's literally, I write about it actually, that was basically my only question I asked of my daughter. Of my son was, he played soccer. How'd you play? Did you win? And did you have a lot of playing time, right? Yeah. He did well in school, so I didn't ask, my daughter did well too, but my point is that it was all about indicators of success, not about relationships, not about how they were doing, not in what was fun today. Nothing. Yeah. Then I started getting this reaction from the culture where people wanted to talk about human relationships, friendships, the importance of these things. And everything changed. and everything changed. And then I realized what I'd done to my kids, right? Of basically buying into a hard over the soft. So then I tried to totally change. But at this point, they're like, late teenagers. Yeah. They're now in their mid-20s. And my daughter's 22 and my son's 24. So early 20s. But my point is at that point, I've changed entirely the way I parent. So the way I focus it on is I bring very much the work explicitly into parenting. So I get them first of all to read the work that I do. So to see the movies that based on my work. I wouldn't have done that earlier because I would have wanted to separate. But now I want them to see the work and I want to know their opinion of it. And I'm very, very focused on listening about their friendships and really trying to think about friendships. And this is the big change for me. I share with them, now this is granted, they're teenage and older, and I mean now they're older, but I started when they were teenagers. I started to talk about my own friendships and my own struggles and my own friendships. Not inappropriately, like I wouldn't share crazy stuff that was, happening with my friend, you know what I mean? Yeah. But things that were like, friends who aren't responsive to when you reach out to them and how much that hurts. And what should I do, asking for their advice. I also started to talk about when girls were bullying each other when my daughter was in high school. I started to have conversations about why do you think girls bully? And why do you think they do those things? With a sense of having some empathy for the bully and not just that they're being a jerk, which was what I would have said. So I think in terms of trying to walk the walk as a parent, was very much trying to take the knowledge I got from listening to boys and young men and thinking about how do you begin to humanize, right, people who don't ask questions, why don't they ask questions? People who bully, why are they bullying? They're obviously suffering. So what are they suffering about? Why do they think that bullying will make them feel better? Also dealing with their own, recognizing that some people, you can sometimes do bad things to your friends and to be reflective about why they did that. So for both my daughter in particular with her girlfriends, sometimes she would do behavior that wasn't very nice. And so we'd have discussions about, why, and not in a judgy way, but trying to sort of have her reveal that sometimes she did mean things and I want her to think about why she did those mean things as a way to understand herself better. So it wasn't just like, well, you were justified because she was mean to you, but actually thinking about why we do that when that's not what we really want. So I began to encourage a kind of self-reflection. Now with my daughter at work, because she has always been more willing to be self-reflective. With my son, he's a little bit more, he's the most gentle person you've ever met in your life, but he gets much less enjoyment of being self-reflective in that way, even though he clearly is self-reflective, but he doesn't want to do it with his mom. And that's I have to say this to all the moms who are listening. That's okay. My son does not need to be sharing his intimate thoughts with me. It's not necessary. But I do feel confident in that when I talk about my own friendships with him, and I even sent him an email I got that was a little bit upsetting to me from a friend to him, and I said, what do you think? And he said, Mom, I think it seems fine. And I said, well, no, but it felt, I felt a little bit hurt by it. And he said, well, what made you feel hurt by it? And then all of a sudden we're having a conversation about why that message made me hurt. And then he ended up agreeing with me. But my point is, that's what I'm doing with my son, right? So it's not about him. He's not having to share. But I'm saying I want to share my email because I want to get your opinion, right? So I'm putting him in the position of helping me. And as a young man who's 24, I think that makes him feel good, that he can be in the position of helping his mom figure out a friendship. And it wasn't a romantic partner, it was a friend. It's a friend. And so to me, it's really trying to take your kids seriously, that they have things to teach you. That's what I want to say. The essence of my work is everybody has something, regardless of their age, they have something to teach and something to learn. So from your children, what do they have to teach you about human connection and about what gets in the way and how to heal? What do they have something to teach you? And then also, what do you want them to learn from you? Right? What do you want them to learn from them? They have a lot to learn from you, but what do you want them to learn from you? Right? And so to take that seriously. But I realize that with my children, I have to walk the walk, and the way to walk the walk is with the understanding is listening with curiosity to them about what they can teach me about them, but also about me and how to have better relationships.
Yeah.
So it really is, and even if my kid was 7, I would say the same thing. And even if my kid was 4, I'd say the same thing. What can they teach me about, I was just sitting with 4-year-olds the other day. I'm sitting into a pre-K class doing a study on curiosity, actually. And I was learning so much from those 4-year-olds in terms of how they were interacting with each other and caring for each other and caring for me. And I'm going to tell you a story because it's going to be nice in the film. So I come into this classroom. It's the first time I've been in this classroom. And all the kids have to wear a name tag so that I know what their names are, okay? And so I'm sitting at a puzzle table, and 2 boys are at the puzzle table, and 1 boy doesn't have his name tag on. And the other boy says, you have to wear your name tag. And the boy says, I don't want to. And he said, well, you have to, because then she won't know what your name is. And he said, she knows my name. I already told her. I just told her my name. And he said, yeah, but you really have to wear it because she may not remember. And so then he says to the teacher, do we have to wear name tags? And the teacher says, well, what do you think? And he said, yeah, I think it's the kind thing to do. And then the boy no longer protested. He got up, he got his name tag, he came back sitting down, and he did this little bit showing me, right? And then wore his name tag the rest of the day. And I'm just saying, that's natural. That kind of kindness, sensitivity to, well, she won't know your name if you don't wear your name tag, that's natural. That's 4-year-olds. And whereas you can imagine in a room full of college students, if someone said, I don't want to wear my name tag, we would say, okay, well, give him space. He doesn't need to wear his name tag.
Exactly.
You know, let him have the autonomy to not wear his name tag. They would never say, well, that's not very nice for someone because then they don't know your name. Right? But that's our 4-year-old self that says, wear your name tag. It's not nice to not wear your name tag. Right? I mean, isn't that gorgeous?
Love it.
And that's and in some ways, that's why I'm saying your children have something to teach you about who you are, not just who they are, but who you are. Fundamentally, your human nature is evident in that 4-year-old. Right? And that's what we need to nurture to create a culture. I call it a pro-social culture, but a culture that nurtures our nature rather than gets in the way. And it's a pro-social culture that is based on, this is why I have optimism. I really do have a lot of optimism. I have optimism that we can create a pro-social culture because I know from children and teenagers that we're born that way. We're born having the relational and emotional intelligence to have high quality relationships. So if I know that from the data, right, that we're born that way, again, I said this earlier, but I'm going to repeat it. It's not a matter of teaching the skills, it's a matter of nourishing them. And we can nourish them because we had them, right? We had them. And so we just need to bring them back and nourish them. And people are starving for us to do so, to build human connection. So I really am a thorough optimist based on the science, based on the data, that we have within us the capacity to change our culture and create a culture that nourishes who we are and what we need. And we now just need to do it.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Way. What an amazing conversation. Thank you for your time, for your insights. Can't wait to read the book and just appreciate your insight very much.
Thank you so much for the wonderful interview. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Yeah.